Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And our first subject tonight certainly had a profound impact on our society. It was Ray Tomlinson, who died recently at the age of 75. And Ray Tomlinson was the father of email. Since there are billions of emails written every year and the written letter is becoming a thing of the past, the inventor of the email was certainly one of the shapers of our new society. Ray Tomlinson was an engineer out of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and then MIT, and after MIT he went to work at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, which was a technology company working on the ARPANET, the forerunner of the Internet. And I'll let him tell the story of how he created email.
In 1971, I was busily trying to find things to use this newfangled network for. I heard about a proposal to send messages to be printed with a printer and stuffed away in mailboxes for people to read. And I said, these messages should go to computers. And so I thought about it for a bit and then decided to put together a system that might do that. And the statement of work did not say, thou shalt go forth and invent email. But we were working on ways in which humans and computers could interact and try to improve that interaction. All the test messages were sent to myself. I had two computers that were literally side by side. The keyboards were about 10 feet apart. And I could wheel my chair from one to the other and type a message in one and then go to the other and see what I had tried to send.
Of course, everybody asked him what the first email ever sent was.
Well, everybody asked that, and of course I don't remember every single word of it. The main thing is there were lots of test messages. These things don't work out of the box because there was no box. Every time you test, you have to generate some kind of a message, and you might drag your fingers across the keyboard or just type the opening phrase from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or something else. So technically the first email is completely forgettable and therefore forgotten.
There's an old saying that the guy who invented poker was brilliant, but the guy who invented the chip was a genius. And Ray Tomlinson invented email, and that was brilliant. But his decision to use the @ symbol for emails was absolute genius.
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't an icon back in 1971, but it was a key on the keyboard that did not appear in users' names, not appear in host names. It made sense. It's a preposition. It means user @ host. It is the only preposition on the keyboard.
Well, if you ask me, that's the most brilliant thing that Ray Tomlinson did. But the English technology writer Bill Thompson describes another one of his accomplishments.
Well, he did something which is much more technical, which probably very few people listening will know about, but I think is actually more important. He developed something called the three-way handshake. Every time you use the internet, you're using a set of network standards called TCP/IP, the Transmission Control Protocol and the Internet Protocol. They are the way that the computers on the internet talk to each other. They find each other and they exchange data. When two computers on the internet decide they want to exchange data, and it doesn't matter what it is, it could be an email, a web page, a file, whatever it is, they have to decide how they're going to talk to each other, how they're going to exchange data, what they're going to say to each other. And the three-way handshake, which begins with one computer sending a message SYN, SYN for synchronized, to another, is the core of every connection made on every computer on the internet at the moment, and indeed since it started in '83. And Ray developed that. So I actually think, as an engineer myself and a former programmer, that's more important than putting the @ sign in email.
Well, coming back to email, a familiar story from our inventors, Ray Tomlinson didn't make a lot of money off the invention.
No, I've often thought about what it would have taken, what fraction of a cent per @ sign would it take to make me very comfortable, and it's a very small fraction.
And finally, he was asked if he ever thought that email would have the influence that it turned out to have.
I guess I could have imagined it. What I didn't imagine was how quickly that would happen. What it took was a very marked growth in networks and computers to make it all happen.
Well, we're going to move on to our feature tonight, George Martin, who died recently at the age of 90. What a genius he was. He was the man who signed the Beatles to EMI Records. He was the one who helped them with their music, and it's safe to say without his musical assistance and advice, the Beatles would not have been the group they were. And to their credit, they acknowledge that. George Martin first heard the Beatles in the middle of 1962. They'd already failed their tryout for Decca, and what attracted him to them was not their music, but their senses of humor. And George Martin was already producing comedy records for EMI, like Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, and the Goon Squad. and he liked their sense of humor, and their music was only a secondary thing. Then he heard their music and saw potential that they didn't see at Decca.
Let's go back a bit. If you remember, the very first record we issued was Love Me Do. Second record we issued was Please Please Me, which was only arrived at after much doubt on my part whether they could ever write a hit song. From that moment onwards, they blossomed. They became wonderful songwriters. But before they showed evidence of that, I still had to have an album out. And so what I did was, I'd been up to the Cavern and I'd seen what they could do. I knew their repertoire, I knew what they were able to perform. And I said, let's record every song you got. Come down to the studios and we'll just whistle through them in a day.
Last night I said these words to my girl. I know you never even tried, girl. Come on, 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 please, 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 oh yeah, like I please you.
In those days, in 1965, Yesterday was recorded, and the very first time I ever wrote a score for the Beatles, the very first time that any Beatle recorded by himself. And that score was for string quartet. Well, when we did it, Paul scribbled on it. He said, "You haven't got my name on it." This is it, yeah. And he wrote on it at the top here, by Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Martin Esquire, and Mozart. Just his reference to the fact that it was a kind of classical piece of music.
Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. Now I need a place to hide away. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
Here's Rita Chakrabarti from BBC4 Last Word to talk on some of the other aspects of George Martin's long career.
Sir George Martin, who's died at the age of 90, was one of the few music producers to become almost as famous as the artists they oversaw. A classically trained musician himself, he went on to steer the Beatles to their phenomenal fame, so much so that he was known to many as the fifth Beatle. Although rock and roll transformed his career, before teaming up with the Fabulous Four, he'd already worked with successful jazz musicians and produced comedy albums, as recalled by fellow music producer and friend Pete Waterman.
He produced The Temperance Seven, which was one of my favourite records, and he was amazed that I'd even heard of The Temperance Seven. It is George Martin, that's the point. You listen to The Temperance Seven, you know the man, you go, that's George Martin.
You're driving me crazy. What did I do? Oh, what did I do?
You're Driving Me Crazy by the Temperance Seven was George Martin's first number one. John Watson, former member of the band, recalls their work together.
We first of all did the backing track for a Peter Sellers number, Ukulele Lady.
If you like a ukulele lady like you.
Of course, we wanted to reproduce a period sound. He went along with whatever the band wanted to do, really.
The word gentleman is overused, but not in his case. He was a real gentleman. And I guess that you would need to be. In the fiery furnace of the Beatles, he must have had to have been a gentleman to get through that. I mean, some of the antics that went on in the studio, you know, when they did All You Need Is Love, I mean, it must have tried his patience completely.
There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung.
I think everybody forgets one thing. He was the first. He was the governor. He invented it. 4 people were shown to this guy that were completely different. And everybody forgets now, you know, we all love the Beatles, but everybody forgets they had one thing different for every other group of the period. They wrote songs.
He wear no shoe shine, he got Trojan football, he got walking finger.
He had the one thing that the Beatles lacked. He had real musical knowledge. He had huge experience in the classical field. This was the one person they could talk to who could show them things that they didn't quite understand.
Come together right now over
begin with, I was the master and they were the pupils. At the end, I think I was the pupil and they were the masters. In the case of Paul, he was very articulate and always had a very good idea of what he wanted, and had very good ideas too. In John's case, he had marvellous ideas, but they were a little bit difficult to realise. Before he died, I spent an evening with him in New York, and we were chatting about old times. And he came up with a remark which shook me. He said, I'd love to re-record everything. I said, John, you can't really mean that. Everything we've ever done, you'd like to re-record. Come on. He said, no, really, I mean it. And I said, what about Strawberry Fields? And we said, oh, especially Strawberry Fields.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
I think that all artists are never happy with what they've recorded and will always go back and re-record it again. I certainly know with Paul McCartney, when we produced him, we were number one. He still kept wanting to redo the lead vocal. And there has to be somebody in the room that says, that's it. And George Martin was the man that said, that's it. When you hear his arrangements, particularly some of his arrangements for the piccolo trumpets and things, you can see he was a classical musician. Who'd ever used a piccolo trumpet on a pop record before? That, to me, is the Beatles.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes.
Penny Lane by, of course, the Beatles. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Richard Mills, who is Senior Lecturer in Popular Culture at St Mary's University in London. And Richard, do you think George Martin could be said to have created the role of music producer?
I think very much so, and just listening to your build-up there, the thing about George Martin is that he's seen quite often as a stuffy English traditionalist, but it's obvious that he was very creative. He used backwards guitars, he used tape loops in the music. Tomorrow Never Knows. He used synth on Strawberry Fields Forever. There was the Stockhausen influence on Revolution Number 9. So in a way, he really was a precursor for progressive rock bands like Pink Floyd. He also hugely influenced krautrock, even synthesizer pioneers like Daniel Miller. So a massive influence and quite idiosyncratic as well.
And it wasn't just pop music, there was a real breadth to his talent.
The diversity of material that he worked on is absolutely unbelievable. Jazz, comedy records. I mean, it really sums him up to think that he was best man at Spike Milligan's wedding. Now that really shows that he was rebellious, he was eccentric, he was creative, and the whole gamut of music he covered, as we've said, jazz, classical, pop, electronic, really massive figure in the history of 20th century popular / classical music, because I do think the distinction really gets blurred and changed by his huge contribution.
And do you think that his work had an influence in what was to come?
Absolutely. The thing is, I would lump him in as a very innovative producer along with Brian Wilson and Phil Spector as well. Little symphonies for the kids. So what he did is he brought in string arrangements, barbershop harmonies. All three of those producers did that, and that has resonated right down through popular culture to 2016. I haven't really mentioned this, those string arrangements, he really reintroduced into pop records what Nelson Riddle and Frank Sinatra had done in the 1950s with their amazing arrangements.
You heard George Martin was the best man at Spike Milligan's wedding. Spike Milligan's one of the Goons, the comedy group that both Monty Python and the Beatles drew from. A very funny guy. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and I believe I can say without contradiction that 100 years from now, we'll still appreciate the contribution that George Martin made to popular music.
There was a time when I got really fed up with being known as the Beatles producer. It seemed as though I'd never done anything else in my life. But time eases a lot of things, and it certainly eases that, because I realised that it was something to be really proud of. And they're my mates, I've been with them for 35 years. So it seemed natural that if I was going to have a final record, and I do have to have a final record, that it should be with music that the Beatles had written.